A story of witches and yellow bricks hides a true American nightmare. In 1889, a winter drought brought actual starvation to the Dakota Plains, shattering towns and dreams. L. Frank Baum watched nearly 3,000 neighbors vanish, and he lost everything. Before fantasy, there was horrifying fact. What brutal secrets did Oz conceal from us? And why did Hollywood erase them? Subscribe to uncover the buried disaster Americans were never meant to forget. Imagine stepping off the train in late 1888. L. Frank Baum and his wife Maud arrived in Aberdeen, Dakota Territory, swept up in a fever of promise. The town was a boomtown, with fresh brick storefronts, new rail lines, and a chorus of boosters predicting endless prosperity. Baum opened Baum's Bazaar, a luxury goods store modeled after Chicago's grand department stores. He filled its shelves with delicate china, fine toys, and elegant novelties, betting that Aberdeen's future would be golden. For a season it was. But by the winter of 1889, the weather turned. Drought cracked the earth, crops withered, and the prairie winds carried away hope. Local newspapers began reporting not just hardship, but the spectre of starvation. Families rationed flour, children went hungry, and the once busy streets grew quiet. Almost 3,000 people abandoned the Aberdeen area over the next 5 years, leaving behind empty houses and shuttered businesses. Baum watched his customers disappear, their credit accounts unpaid, their dreams dissolved by dust and debt. By January 1890, Baum's Bazaar closed its doors for good. The optimism that had drawn him west collapsed into anxiety and loss. With his savings gone, Baum turned to the only thing left: words. He became editor of the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer, writing for a community that was unraveling. In his columns, he tried to make sense of a world where prosperity had vanished overnight and survival was no longer guaranteed. The fairy tale had not yet been written. For Baum and for Aberdeen, the nightmare was all too real. Picture the Great Plains. The collapse that emptied Aberdeen was only a glimpse of what lay ahead for the entire country. By the early 1890s, the optimism that had built towns like Aberdeen had curdled into fear. The panic of 1893 struck with brutal force, sending shockwaves through every corner of the American economy. Railroads failed by the dozens. Banks shut their doors. Factories that once ran around the clock stood silent, their gates chained shut. In cities and towns, bread lines stretched for blocks, and the word unemployed became a daily reality for millions. Official estimates from the time are imprecise, but modern economic historians agree. Unemployment soared from about 3% in 1892 to nearly 12% in 1893, then climbed to almost 19% at the peak of the crisis in 1894. That meant over 3 million workers suddenly found themselves without jobs. In major industrial cities, the numbers were even more staggering. Labor Bureau surveys in states like New York and Michigan reported that during the harshest winter months, roughly 1/3 to nearly 1/2 of all workers were idle. Neighborhoods that once buzzed with industry became landscapes of enforced idleness and hunger. Nearly 3,000 people had already abandoned Aberdeen, but now across the country, families packed their belongings into wagons or boxcars, searching for any place that might offer work or relief. The prairie exodus became a national migration as America's economic engine sputtered and stalled. The scale of the disaster dwarfed anything the country had seen before. For millions, the promise of a fresh start had given way to a grinding uncertainty, with no end in sight. Picture a Kansas farm in 1891. The barn doors swing open to a prairie wind, the fields already stripped bare. In just 4 years, more than 11,000 Kansas farms vanished into foreclosure, their owners forced out by debts they could never repay. State records show that cropland was mortgaged at nearly half its true value, 45% in Kansas, 46% in South Dakota, and 44% in Minnesota. For families who had wagered everything on the promise of the land, it meant living one bad harvest away from ruin. Corn prices collapsed to just 10 cents a bushel in Kansas, barely half of what it cost to grow. That price turned a season of labor into a loss, and each drop in the market pushed another family closer to eviction. Children watched as wagons filled with furniture creaked down the road, leaving behind empty houses and fields gone to weeds. Dorothy's journey did not begin in a storybook Kansas, but in a real world where the farm was lost, and home was something you could only hope to find again. The scarecrow stands in a cornfield, arms stretched wide, convinced he has nothing to offer. His first words in Baum's book are plain: "I haven't any brain, only straw." Picture that image, small and lonely in a vast field. For decades, American farmers heard the same verdict, from politicians, from bankers, from cartoonists in glossy Eastern magazines. Populist rallies were mocked as gatherings of hayseeds and bumpkins. Editorial cartoons in Harper's Weekly and Puck drew farmers slack-jawed and barefoot, too simple, they said, to understand the gold standard or the mysterious workings of Wall Street. But the truth is more complicated. Out on the plains, farmers tracked prices, calculated interest, and organized for monetary reform. Their demand for silver coinage was not ignorance, it was survival. The ridicule burrowed under the skin, feeding a sense of doubt and defeat as real as any drought. Yet like the scarecrow, these so-called brainless farmers often proved the sharpest minds in the field, quietly building a case for reform that would echo for generations. The Tin Woodman's story begins with a sharp blade. Once a living man, he cut off each limb with his own axe, cursed to keep chopping until nothing remained but metal. In Baum's Oz, he stands frozen, rusted solid, unable to move or feel. For millions of industrial workers in the 1890s, that image was all too real. As the Depression deepened, factory output plunged by as much as 30%. Steel mills and rail yards went quiet. Men who had built America's cities and railroads found themselves discarded, waiting in line for bread or shelter, their skills and spirit left to rust. The Tin Man's missing heart captured what the factory system had taken: human warmth, dignity, the chance to care for family. Meanwhile, another figure roared onto the national stage. William Jennings Bryan, the so-called Lion of the West, electrified the 1896 Democratic Convention with a single line: "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." His words thundered through the hall and across the prairies. But Bryan lost the presidency in 1896, again in 1900, and once more in 1908. Each defeat left the gold standard untouched, and the suffering of workers and farmers unrelieved. In Oz, the lion's roar is loud, but courage falters at the moment of truth. On the ground, the hope for real change slipped away, leaving only echoes. Open Baum's original novel, published in 1900. Dorothy's shoes glint unmistakably as silver. The text repeats the detail, describing a pair of silver shoes with pointed toes and a deep and mysterious history. For readers in the 1890s, those silver shoes were not just magic. They were a political statement. The Coinage Act of 1873 had quietly erased the silver dollar, locking the country to gold and plunging farmers and workers into debt. Then, In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, forcing the Treasury to buy millions of ounces of silver each month. The battle over silver and gold raged in headlines and on the campaign trail. When MGM brought The Wizard of Oz to the screen in 1939, Dorothy's shoes shimmered ruby red. The change was chosen to dazzle in Technicolor, but it stripped away the original monetary message. The silver on gold allegory was gone, replaced by spectacle. In Washington, the wizard's curtain took the form of closed-door deals and secret telegrams. When the Treasury's gold reserves slipped below the danger line in early 1895, President Grover Cleveland turned to Wall Street. J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds arranged $65 million in gold. The loan was negotiated in private and revealed to Congress only after the ink dried. While politicians congratulated themselves for saving the dollar, Kansas newspapers filled with stories of families forced off their land. County obituaries recorded fathers who took their own lives after eviction, leaving fields to weeds and children to charity. The government's Conjuring Act restored faith in gold for bankers and bondholders, but on the prairie, the only magic left was the vanishing act of homes, hope, and lives erased from the map. Even now, economic hardship hides beneath comforting myths, real suffering replaced by spectacle. As debates over debt, foreclosure, and who controls money return, the lesson remains: stories can distract or reveal. Which version we believe shapes whose voices we hear and whose pain we choose to remember. Share your thoughts below.